So you can start with what the definition of like segregation, like de jure, de facto segregation is, and I really like Rothstein's point of view with this on how, although there is some truth to de facto segregation, being that there it was kind of made up of like individual choices that Black families would want to live with Black families, so that's the reason why they kind of like segregated. Although there is some truth to that, I'm sure there are Black families that would rather be surrounded by mostly Black families than white families. There's also, as he pointed out in the book, many policies um, that were put in place by state governments, the federal government, that would enforce like residential segregation, and that's what we're going to go over, like with the many things like public housing, like restrictive covenants, all of that. Well, restrictive covenants were more private, but yeah, we'll get to that all. So I guess we'll start with public housing.
So
So,
just before we begin that, I remember in your flow document, do you want me to introduce myself?
oh yeah, you should introduce yourself here.
Yeah. Just to establish my, my background. So my name is Andrew Budrus, and this is my 26th year teaching history. So in New York, we call it social studies. I had my first 2 years. Well, first of all, I grew up myself in a town called Bethpage, but really so far on the outskirts of Bethpage that in practical terms, if I describe where I grew up, it's really more the town of Levittown, which is figured prominently in this book. So that was my background as far as where I grew up. I went to Catholic school as a kid, so I only went to 1 year of public school, but I did grow up in a community that is really featured a lot in the book. I went to a small private college in upstate New York, went to Siena College, got my master's at Stony Brook. I'm a doctoral student at Hofstra University on Long Island. But my first 2 years of teaching, I taught in the Brownsville section of Brooklyn, which is 100% free and reduced lunch. 100% of my students lived in poverty. It was my school, PS 298, was an entirely minority district. There were no white students at all. It was high crime. It still is, although from what I understand, it's improved quite a bit. But I taught 2 years in that school district. And then ironically, the principal who hired me for that school, as soon as he hired me, about a week later, he left and he went to Belport High School, which is kind of how I got my connection to where I've worked for the last 24 years. So I'm the lead teacher at the social studies department in Belport High School. I've been between two positions, lead teacher and department chair. I've been in a supervisory role for probably about 13 or 14 years at Belport. And I teach AP US Government and Politics, but I've basically taught most courses for New York State, New York State social studies curriculum. So that would be my background.
Yeah, I guess I'll introduce myself as well. I am Jahid Hossein, and I am a current freshman here at Lehigh University. I plan on majoring in physics, and I'm currently on a pre-med track. So hopefully in the next around 8 to 10 years, I'll be a doctor in my residency. And I think even being a doctor also has some relevance, because being a doctor, you have to be very open-minded to like who your patients are, what experiences they go through. And me personally, I live in East Patchogue, New York, and the area I live in is an area that's predominantly African American, and I didn't really pay much mind to it as a child, but I could probably walk like half a mile. I cross the train tracks and I see an area that looks like it's much more like wealthy and predominantly white people. And I didn't really question it as a child, but growing up, I started to realize that patterns of like higher crime rates in the area I lived, and more or less in the area that's like very close and I started to question um, why is it why is like the quality of housing where I live much less than the quality of housing somewhere that's only like half a mile away, and it didn't really um, I didn't really start to understand that until I read the book The Color of Law, um, where I learned about all the policies where the how the government would residentially segregate areas. There'd be all the tactics the government would use. There would be tactics that neighborhoods would use. And I think all of that has uh, still a profound effect on today, although these policies took place nearly a century ago. Um, so yeah, that's my background, and
I should add another piece of my background. I currently live in that part of the community that is that half-mile walk from your family's house.
yeah,
So we literally in this podcast we represent both sides of the track.
yeah,
Because I do live in the now, even within my section of the community, if I walked a half mile further south, I would get to multi-million-dollar homes that are owned by celebrities. But it certainly has to be noted that where I am, it has all those features you were talking about: much higher housing quality, much lower crime, and I am a short walk from
yeah.
the section neighborhood where it's got a lot more of those problems you're discussing.
Yeah. So I guess we could start with public housing and what it is and how the government would segregate public housing. So what public housing is, from like what I understand, was it was made kind of to be like temporary housing. Is that right? And or would you
Yeah.
say it was more permanent?
Well, so I think it kind of goes back to a time period after World War II,
Yeah.
especially where we normally refer to this as suburbanization of America. Having grown up in right close proximity to Levittown, which is often called America's first suburb.
Yeah.
The everyone who I grew up with had family members, fathers, mothers, some at the very least grandparents that grew up in the city. So it was sort of part of the conversation to say, where are your people from? Queens or Brooklyn? It's
Yeah.
generally those two places. And this was an opportunity following World War II to move out of urban environments and have a very small, modest home that you could own. It's funny, I always laugh about how I would never want to live there anymore. I thought it was completely lacking. I think it does completely lack any kind of charm or community feel. It's just clustered houses with strip malls and that kind of thing. But it was really desirable to people to be able to move out of apartments following World War II. And with the economic boom that came with World War II, this was people's dream. So there's still elderly people who live in that community, and I feel like they're still sort of like kissing the ground, thinking this is this American dream that they're hoping for. However, with all these restrictions, I mean, I think what really, we certainly on the face of it, we know that there was a concerted effort to keep minorities, specifically African-American buyers, out of that movement.
Yeah.
And when they were kept out of that movement, when that was not open to them to be property owners in suburbs, the answer was the option of public housing, to remain in the city, to remain in these clustered, high capacity buildings. But I think probably one of the most important parts of the story is why were these potential buyers kept out of this market, especially when they would not have been kept out of the market by market forces. I mean, I'm kept out of certain markets for certain cars and certain houses because I simply don't have the money to buy, you know, a luxury automobile, or I don't have the money to buy one of those homes that's a half mile south. And those, I think, in the general economic system that we've accepted in America, in capitalism, that's acceptable. That market forces are going to keep you out of certain markets. That is not the case for African American buyers. They had the money. They had demonstrated the same commitment to the country in their military service. They fit all the criteria for somebody who's going to enter this suburbanization trend. They were kept out because of these policies that are related to, well, it was just motivated by prejudice and racism. And I think the heart of it is something that is lost on a lot of people in the United States. I don't think people understand, they're not cognizant of how much or how often their riskiness is quantified. Like, you look at me, you look at you, we both have credit scores. That's a quantification of how risky we are to lend money to. And right now, you're riskier than me because I have a lot more assets that can be seized, and you don't have as many assets. And you know, that's a reality of our economic system, that people are always quantifying risk. What was especially tragic, kind of like I think the launch point for a lot of these policies, is that there was this baked in risk that was grafted onto any African Americans. They were seen as risky to communities, risky for loans, risky for the likelihood of the success of a major housing development project. People generally want as many buyers as possible, drives up the price. But the perception, and it was backed by laws, was that African Americans are inherently risky to the success of these projects. And that allowed some of these developers to kind of wrap themselves in this cloak of just, hey, look, part of being a business person is risk aversion. We don't want to bring in too many risky variables. But then on a human level, we're talking about human beings, and we're talking about people that should have been allowed to participate in these things. So I think it kind of gets back to the public housing question about, it was seen as risky to the success of suburbanization to include African Americans at its outset. And what was not seen as risky was to leave them behind in public housing, especially public housing that was very often the worst of the public housing that you could get.
Because I know that difference between, like, if you were like a white person who was in public housing, usually the facility, because you would be segregated from the African Americans, and those facilities would actually have better services that would be provided to them. And that also has to do with the fact that kind of like it is kind of leaving them behind, in a sense, leaving them out of things, like leaving them out of like good service, mainly because of I'd say racist viewpoints and an agenda against them. Which
I think I might have been, I wanted to focus on the risk aversion, but that's a little charitable too. I mean, for some people, it's just out of a really kind of rancid prejudice and racism. But then there's an alliance between people who are really hateful
Mhm.
and people who support that system because they say, hey, look, it's too risky for the success of this whole project. And
Yeah.
that coalition leaves African Americans out of probably the most important wealth building window that, well, it's hard to talk about in the context of all of US history, but certainly one of the most important windows.
Yeah. Because those new suburban houses would build like rapidly gain wealth over time, and then you could like pass off the wealth to generations, while African Americans were not allowed that privilege.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, personally, I'm one of three kids, so my brother and sister and I, we all went to college, uh, and my parents were pretty lower on the income scale,
Yeah.
but I was unaware when I was able to go to college. I mean, I had to take out loans and all that, but what made it work for my parents was the wealth that came from the equity of their house.
Yeah.
And that was really lost on me. I and it became part of how I view the world. I I said, look, my parents are hardworking people, and that's why, they scrimped and we didn't really go on vacations, and those are all true things. Those are all variables that played into the fact that my brother and sister and I all got to go to college, but I never factored in the variable of the equity of their home, which they bought for $33,000 in 1969. And that was purchased from somebody who had bought the house right after World War II for probably about $8,000.
Yeah.
So you had the first buyer who quadrupled their investment, and then my parents bought the house. My father passed away last year, but my mother is still in that house. One day when she passes on and we sell that house, I would suspect it would be worth $600,000. So not only did I got lower interest, my parents got lower interest financing because the value of their home, but it's the kind of thing that's going to affect my daughter's future and even my sister's kids, my niece and nephew.
Yeah.
So it's a variable that was so important to my life, and I was just unaware of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I took some notes here on so I wanted to include this because I thought like the connotation from this leaflet was interesting to say the least. I'll just read it. So this was in 1916. So it was actually from the Color of Law. I'll just describe what it says. So it urges voters to adopt a referendum that prohibited African Americans from moving onto predominantly white blocks. So, and I quote, an entire block ruined by Negro invasion. And you can see the negative connotation with ruined and invasion, using words like that. And then it says save your home in all caps, which I thought was very interesting. And those were the types of things that would go around kind of promoting that agenda against letting African Americans settle onto like predominantly white blocks. And that also goes into like racial zoning, in which African Americans weren't. There would be like ordinances where they wouldn't be allowed to actually move on a block that was predominantly white until that was overruled by the. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this right, but Buchanan.
Oh, the Buchanan. I believe it's
Buchanan versus Worley case, in which the Supreme Court decided that an ordinance, I'm pretty sure in Louisville, Kentucky, was deemed unconstitutional. So then after that, other places would try to like get around, like sneak around that decision by giving like other reasons as to why African Americans wouldn't be able to be moved on the block. One being, I'm pretty sure that it was because interracial relationships weren't allowed, so they wouldn't be allowed to move on the block for a reason like that. So I thought that was interesting.
Yeah,
Although I'm pretty sure in those cases as well, the Supreme Court did, or not, maybe not the Supreme Court, but the court ruled that those reasons weren't enough. So,
and you can see the common thread right up till today, where some people feel like they need permission to sort of act on these on their own prejudice. So first we have to build a sense of urgency. So in the flyer, they talk about an invasion, which is dehumanizing language. A lot of times invasion, infestation, they'll dehumanize the people that they're targeting. But then also they're serving up a justification that is outside of racism and prejudice. They'll say, look, you're saving your family, you're protecting your investment. This is what anyone would do. One of the things that I think history teachers sometimes don't explicitly explain to students well enough is that the roots of American racism are very often, you see a situation where people are capitalizing on a sense of chivalry. We must protect women. And that's, when you talk about, hey, look, if this neighborhood integrates, pretty soon you're going to find that your kid is going to go to a school dance with someone who's African American, and that's going to be a hot button issue that's also going to rally people to support these racist policies.
mm-hmm.
So it's like we see, and like you see it in politics today. People feel like they need permission to act on these impulses.
Yeah.
And once you get that justification, people are more likely to do pretty awful things.
Yeah. Yeah. So I thought racial zoning was really interesting, but like reading that the Buchanan versus Worley case, in which pretty Worley, the African American, was trying to purchase the home, but because I think 8 out of the 10 houses were owned by white owners, so the ordinance in that area forbade him from doing that. So going to court, Supreme Court overruled that, which was a pretty landmark case in the sense that now, like, you have a big kind of like a stepping stone, or no, not a stepping stone, more like a fence or a barrier that you had to climb over, that now is like overruled. But then other policies would be put into place to kind of avoid this decision. And the first one I want to talk about is like restrictive covenants. And these are like private agreements that the purchaser of property would have to, they're like obliged to assume. So in like the early part of the 20th century, most of these covenants included somewhere like a phrase that said never to sell this property to an African American or something of that, or like Mongolian, I think I saw somewhere, phrases like that.
Yeah.
Which, yeah, very dehumanizing language.
Oh, yeah. And that is, I mean, I could throw a tennis ball from my backyard and it would land in a place that had a restricted covenant.
Yeah.
I at least I'm aware, it's well documented that there were restricted covenants in Levittown. I'm not. It's possible there were restricted covenants in Bethpage, which is 1 block over from me. But in Levittown, I mean, first of all, there was language, as you know from the book, that said that people of the
Yeah.
Negro race cannot buy these homes. In fact, there's even a part of the restricted covenants. It's almost tragically comic in that it says the only people Negroes to be allowed into the community would be as domestic servants. And I call it tragically comic because these are low income whites. They cannot afford to pay anyone to clean their homes. You know,
Yeah.
this idea that, but that's a theme in American history also, where racism is seen in terms of relative advantage, that even if you're at a very low place in society as a white person economically, you're always reserved this spot of being above Black
Yeah.
Americans. And so the fact that they would put that in there about domestic servants, maybe they were trying to sell this idea of prosperity, but these are not prosperous people that are buying these
Mhm.
homes. But there is an expression that the fish are the last to be aware of water. They just live in it.
Mhm.
And I that was where I lived. There was zero people of color anywhere in my neighborhood. I feel like there was one African American family that moved in temporarily about 6 blocks from my house, but uh, I was unaware that I mean that was an explicit prohibition.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of ways to accomplish segregation. That was the most well, the most naked way of doing it. And when I'm not sure if you remember this, but when we did this project in my class, when you were in my class, kind of began the whole explanation of the project to say that I had been disappointed in myself. I mean, this is my 26th year teaching, and I'm I'm a social studies teacher. I'm a supervisor. 2020, I won Long Island High School Social Studies Teacher of the Year, whatever, which is like teaching's not a contest. So it's like as an award given to me by people who never actually were taught by me, but take it as it is. Like I did get a little notoriety in that year. And I, like a lot of people who become social studies teachers, I was fascinated by history even as a young guy. I was unaware of this, even though I was on this track to be a history teacher and I lived in those communities. And it wasn't until college I started to read about it. And then I became aware for sure. And then it wasn't until my co-teacher, Rodney O'Neill, we taught an inclusion class together, and he's a special ed certified person who's duly certified in history. He gave me as a Christmas present, and he's African American himself. He gave me as a Christmas present the book, The Color of Law. And when I read that book, it really made an impression on me. It filled in a lot of the gaps. But I mean, these are gaps that I had. And
Yeah.
I have to say, I got to be considered on the list of expert educators in social studies. And I had those gaps,
Mhm.
so it was, it shows the power of hiding history, because I'm a hard person to hide stuff from. I'm very inquisitive about this sort of thing. For us at Belport High School, it was the after the killing of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter protests. I got together the social studies teachers, not all of them, but a lot of them, and including my supervisor, our director. And after we had attended a Black Lives Matter protest in our community and saw that it was well attended, we started brainstorming and said we have to do something that is recognizably different. If we don't do anything, then we're failing at the one contribution that we could make. And that was where we floated the idea of having students read the book. I had already read it, and it was considering how important the legacy is. It was just the sort of thing that it was just going to be unacceptable to not, in a really intentional way, try and help students understand this.
Yeah.
And my director was really supportive. He immediately planned to buy, like 150 copies of these books, and so I was really proud of her to be so supportive also.
Yeah. So yeah, that's interesting you mentioned that, because that was actually one of my that was like one of the key motivations I had to doing this project, because I remember what you said. If there's one thing I remember you telling us in class that how like I don't remember if the word was ashamed, more like disappointed that you know, as a history teacher, with all your interest in it, didn't even know all of the information. And then, you know, I started to think to myself, I was like, if he doesn't know, think about just the average citizen who only just goes to school for, let's say, high school, or even in college. I'm sure many college students don't even know. Then I started to think about, it's like, yeah, it's like something that's kind of like being hidden from people, and that I think that people should start to learn more about. And I think it's like good to know what your history is, instead of like in textbooks where there wouldn't really be any information on like residential segregation. Like I don't remember reading any, like reading the AP US history textbook. I don't remember reading anything about residential segregation. So
yeah, and we had a conversation as history teachers, and I said, look, we accept that we don't teach everything, but there's two standards that are very basic. One is we have to teach things accurately, but then also we have to teach things that have relevance today.
yeah.
And it was so clear that there is relevance today to this issue, specifically to our students in our district, but really anyone in the United States. So we also had to fit this into a political context that was going on as we established the project. And we had purchased the books, and we had presented to the school. Well, first we presented to the school board the idea, so as elected representatives in our community. Mm-hmm. We purchased the books all about 3 months before the Biden-Trump 2020 election, when this is a very, in terms of the United States, a very high voter turnout election, lots of polarization, and there was risk there also, because I can say pretty confidently that there would be several school districts that would not have allowed us to buy this book and not allow us to have the book read in class. Mm-hmm. When I got that award, and I'm sometimes in contact with my high school that I went to, St. Anthony's High School, which is, I would call it I don't know if I'd call it an elite private school, but it's probably a notch below elite private school. It's a very highly regarded private school. And I noticed that they had an initiative to bring back students of color. There's never been many students of color at St. Anthony's High School, but they were bringing back students of color from a couple of decades ago to talk honestly about experiences of prejudice that they had at St. Anthony's High School. And I was really proud that they were doing that. I think that was one of their responses to the death of George Floyd, that they said, we got to talk to people who graduated in the 1990s, and they got to tell us what it was like to be a person of color at St. Anthony's. So I was really proud of them. So I contacted the school and I said, hey, I have this project that I created based on the book, The Color of Law. And I think it would be really helpful for St. Anthony's kids who tend to be higher income for them to understand these things. And I said, I'd be willing to share it. Certainly, I don't charge for this sort of thing. I've presented The Color of Law at the Long Island Council for Social Studies conference for teachers. I presented it. I've presented part of it at the New York State Council for Social Studies, and I'm waiting to hear if I'm going to get accepted at the national conference next year to share this project. So I figured, hey, I went to that high school and I sent them all the information. I said I'd be willing to come to talk to your teachers on how to do it. I didn't even get a no. They just kind of ghosted me on it. And I'd be happy to hear from them again, but it was a risk even at Belport High School, which is the diversity of Belport High School is economic and it's racial, but it's also politically diverse. You know, that if you look at the results of the 2020 election by neighborhoods within our school district, there was heavy Democratic support, heavy Republican support. And so far, I haven't had a lot of blowback in year 2 of doing this project. But as I presented the project to teachers from around Long Island and around New York State, I always get teachers that will say, I won't be allowed to do this.
Yeah.
You know? And it's not even just a question of resources, because I have a version of it where you don't have to buy the book, because I understand some school districts can't do that.
Yeah.
But still, people would say, I just won't be able to. And that's happening right now. So what kept me from knowing it when I should have known it? What kept me continuing to teach this traditional difference between de facto segregation and de jure segregation? This traditional narrative is that once de jure segregation by law was disassembled, segregation continues because of people's preferences.
Yeah.
I taught that to my students.
Yeah.
And it was clearly wrong. You know, so this incorrect narrative it still continues because of the political context people are in. So
would you say that St. Anthony's, or like many schools in that sense, they didn't want to like even consider having a book like The Color of Law read in their classrooms because backlash from like parents? Or
yeah, I would think so. I mean, I would say that part of it is the fact that in a private school you have customers. I mean, I like to look at our public school parents as customers too. I feel like that's a good mindset to maintain good quality, because people are paying through their taxes for their public school, but it's especially obvious in a private school. You can pick up and go. If you see on an internet chat that kids are being exposed to the fact that the reason why their neighborhoods aren't diverse is because of these policies that had existed. And these policies existed and were supported not that long ago. So, you know, it brings up uncomfortable conversations. And I don't want to make too many assumptions about why they didn't get back to me because I didn't talk to them about it. I would have appreciated if somebody said, like, look, at the very least, you know, our curriculum's jam-packed. I don't think we can fit this into it. Or I'd be skeptical of that response, but like, because there's ways to do it. But I don't know. We'll see. Maybe it was a break in communication. I look at the project itself as an open source project. So there's ways to sell your instructional materials as a teacher. I'd never do that. Really with anything that I produce, but I would never do it with this one. And you know, so if anyone were to contact me and ask me to use the project, I always tell them, yes, you can, and you can modify it in any way you'd like.
Mhm.
I don't have, I'd be fascinated to find out if people can improve upon it. One of the things that was intentional about the project was, so it's what we call a PBL project. So some people call it PBL problem-based learning, and some people call it project-based learning. It's really not that important what the difference is. I prefer problem because I like to establish there's a problem that groups of students are going to try and solve. And I had to do a lot of thinking about what is the problem we're trying to get them to solve. And I very intentionally didn't make the problem to be solved by the students how to fix these issues, because I took it a step, I dialed it back a little bit, and I said, the problem is that people don't know this happened. Because so the focus of it was how, I think my driving question, which is what you have in a PBL lesson generally, is how can we raise awareness? And that was deliberately stopping short of how can we undo legacies of systemic racism or something, because I didn't think it would be, first of all, it would be putting a little bit like cart before the horse. First, people need to know what happened. And then eventually they might, like a smaller group of people might get into conversations about what to do about it. But first they need to know what happened. And then also in a diverse setting, it's hard for me to put 4 or 5 kids together and get them to agree on a solution.
Yeah.
It's not even important to me that they do. What's important to me is that we stop hiding it.
Yeah.
That's the whole thing. And I do think there's still a lot of social studies teachers who are omitting it. And then they're graduating from schools very well educated, but missing a really relevant part of the story.
Mhm.
And that's a story that is important for people of all backgrounds to understand. But it's, if you think about the Brown versus Board of Education case, I shouldn't test you right now to see if you remember like how Thurgood Marshall's legal team really won that case. But one of the major moments was a sociological study where they were exposing young African-American girls to dolls. I don't know if you remember that part. But it was these young African-American girls were being given the choice between white dolls and black dolls. And they were asked what their preference was. And these young African-American girls were constantly picking the white dolls. And then when they ascribed attributes to these dolls, like which of these dolls is good, the African-American girls would pick the white doll. Which one is pretty? They would pick the white doll. When they said, which one is naughty? They would pick the doll that looked most like them. And through those sociological studies, Thurgood Marshall worked for the NAACP to win this Brown versus Board of Education case. He was able to establish that there's a burden that is carried by these African-American students simply because they're segregated.
Mm-hmm.
They're carrying this burden that white students don't have to carry. And I think there's a lot of parallels here, where if you have people who have been denied home equity because of systemically racist housing programs, if they see some of their classmates that have a wider array of choices for school,
Yeah.
or they see inheritances in the form of property just higher,
Mm-hmm.
I understand if people mistakenly assume that this was a failing by their parents, or at least some kind of some sort of very savvy move that was made by my parents, when really it came down to a restricted covenant decades before they were born. It came down to redlining, where the simple act of being a minority group member made you more financially risky, and that was backed by law. But here you have students sitting in class and they're kind of observing their classmates and saying, I wish my parents had, I mean, I'm not sure if they feel this way, but I hope they don't. I do think that the more we hide the story, the more likely this is that they might carry this burden of the perception that some groups of kids, just their families have it more together, they're more savvy.
Yeah.
They don't know the origins of it.
Yeah. I
Do
think
you
that's
mind if I
also. Yeah.
step away 1 sec? I'm just
Okay, so what were we talking about?
so just yeah, I think we just sort of ended off with how not an ignorance of this by everyone who's affected, whether it's an advantage that their family might have gotten or a disadvantage, is it creates burdens that are part of an unequal experience for people, that it can affect even just how they conceive of their own family's history. And that's especially a problem.
Yeah. I also think that it kind of like, if you're a person of color, and like with that the experiment, it kind of like gives you the impression that that you start to feel inferior to them, and but you've not really given a reason as to why. So that's something that just like sustains itself, and that's something you just believe to be true, where you just feel inferior, which I think is just which is, well, it's wrong. That it's that's definitely a wrong statement to say that they're inferior in any sort of way, because that is dehumanizing. But in that context, it's also no other way for them to see it. So yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It would be like teaching global history and leaving out imperialism.
Hmm.
And then all of a sudden, people from non-Western countries, they'd say like, well, how come my GDP of the country happens to be lower, or how come it took longer to catch up to it, and that's really one of the values of knowing history, is to
Yeah.
understand this context, and that was something that I wish I had done a better job at earlier in my career, but I do know that it was kind of the legacy of my own education that was
Yeah.
partly the problem. But then also, um, we really wanted to see the Black Lives Matter protests of 2020, which are by some measures the largest protests in American history, by participation. We just could not have our choices as social studies teachers just unaffected by that.
Hmm.
Because we knew that when we came back in the summertime, and if you remember, we were in shutdown when this all developed, and then we had the summer, and we said our students of color are going to be watching us, as they should, to see if there was any difference, and this was one of the ways we meant to try and address that.
Yeah, that's good. That Bellport is taking action, like taking steps towards like educating students to like history that like not really forgotten in the sense that it's not taught properly, at least. So yeah, I'm very thankful that I was able to read that book and take some insights from it, because it made me realize like not much later. It's only been a year, but I ask a lot of people around here just to like get a concept of what they know about it. Many people don't know much about it, and every time they like, sometimes I read the book in the lounge or something like that. They look at that book, it's like, oh, what is that? So then I'll like, thank you for asking that. I'll explain like I'll explain to you what this book is for like 30 minutes now. Uh, so
Yeah, it's there's a lot to learn about that experience, just about how information travels and how people within networks influence each other. Because, you know, I had a friend who bought it for me as a Christmas present,
yeah,
and then it travels across the network into someone in a study lounge in Lehigh whose teacher didn't teach them about it.
yeah,
And I am really fully aware that this is a narrow experience. Doesn't address, like, it doesn't supply like a full understanding of systemic racism, but it's progress.
yeah,
My hope is that's one of the reasons why I'm kind of bending over backwards with these conferences and social studies conferences to try and get the word out, uh, because I'm hoping, this last October, we did that Long Island conference, and then mentioned it. We were back in Albany this year to present, and then hopefully it'll be in Philadelphia next December at the national conference. But it's possible that if somebody attends from Oklahoma or something, that might lead them to do some sort of innovative project on the Tulsa race riots,
yeah,
and that you could have a ripple effect. It's disappointing how slow this can be, but I think that would be moving in the right direction.
yeah. I mean, every struggle, it takes time in order to not necessarily find a solution, but for like awareness to spread and things like that. So yeah, I think this podcast might be posted on, like, we use like course site. It's called course site, like where we submit all our assignments. So I'm not sure if that's true, but if it is, like other students could like watch this podcast if they really wanted to.
Mhm.
And I think there are some students in that class who definitely be willing to. Um, but
So,
yeah,
and even to capitalize on a social network, then if anyone is watching, would like, just ask Jahid for my school email address, and if you'd like to forward the instructional materials about the project to your high school that you went to, I would be more than happy to hand it off. And also, because I have materials for distribution, so of course there's no cost, and then to send it off with the understanding that people can use it in whatever way they would like.
mhm,
I'd love to get an email from somebody to say this is how I used it, but if they want to use just a pinch of it, or they want to expand upon it or whatever, I'd be more than happy.
okay, yeah.
Sometimes that's some positive pressure too. If you know you didn't learn about it in your high school, you could say, hey, here it is. And then see, it's possible that you could expand awareness a little bit in your own hometown too.
Yeah, I hope they reach out to me, and if not, I might try reaching out to them and be like, "Hey, watch my podcast, guys." Yeah. Uh, but yeah, no, I was actually talking to one of the kids in my dorm today. This different kid than who I was talking to before. Uh, this was actually like recent. This was like 6, 7 hours ago. Um, I was just taking notes on like what I wanted to talk about, and he's walking around, and like he sees me, and he looks at the book, and he's like he recognized it, and he was like, oh, the first thing he mentioned to me was redlining, and and I was like, oh, cool, you know about that? And he was like, yeah, it's crazy. Uh, and I don't know, it kind of like made me like happy that he also like he uh, also knew about it. Well, like I'm sure like many other people don't, but yeah, we were talking about it for a little bit, and then we got to like the he started talking about like how people can make like profit off of like residential segregation, like in the sense of like, and I was like, oh, so you're talking like blockbusting with like the real estate agents who would they would use strategies like kind of like scare tactics in predominantly white, more like border black and white neighborhoods, so that they would you would you would use tactics to expose the white people of that neighborhood that there were black people living there, and that it would turn into an African American slum, which is what the book says. Like I know one of the tactics was you would have like a mother strolling her baby around the neighborhood, or real estate agents would knock on the door with an African American man next to them and ask like the homeowner if the house was on sale. Because of that, real estate agents would be able to purchase houses from the white that white community for much cheaper than what they were valued, and then they'd sell them for much higher to African Americans.
Yeah, and it's so people were, once they could create a panic, which is built on prejudice, then they would depress the prices of the homes, and then speculators could come in, grab up those homes, and then resell them to people of color at inflated rates.
Yeah.
So they, yeah, it's interesting. There are opportunists that profited from this sort of discrimination, but overall, every time you create problems in the market, you are ultimately costing people more money. I mean, if Levittown opened up all their initial houses to every buyer, they potentially, I mean, their business model was to sort of sell it at a fixed price, but they could have potentially sold it at a higher price with more buyers. And that's basically capitalism. And there's a cost to segregation and discrimination and racism, especially when it's systemic, that people are unaware of too. I was just looking up on my phone. There's a book that I have to begin to listen to because I heard great things about it. But it's called The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee. And she talks about the cost of racism to people of every background, including white Americans. That if a woman is kept out of medical school and she's kept out of medical research, then society is denied her talents. And for men, that means longer waits to be treated, or maybe discoveries that go undiscovered. And for somebody who's selling a home, restricted covenants are not in their economic interests to have less buyers when there are people who have the ability to buy. And I think that's one of the things too that students, certainly people in the United States need to understand, is that they're worse off for not knowing this story, and they're worse off because of these policies. There are built-in advantages for some groups and built-in disadvantages, but I mean the idea, the concept that we're all worse off is an umbrella concept, and within that there's just a bunch of terrible outcomes for society because of these policies. So, yeah, that's for sure.
Sorry, that was
sure.
Yeah, no, it's like, I don't know. It's just like, the more you read through the book, the more like, tactics that would be used, more and more like different ways to get around, like, I don't know, like say the law, because technically, I forgot to mention, but the Shelley versus Kramer case, I think that it ruled that, I have the notes here. So the restrictive covenants were technically private agreements. So courts would rule under the notion that they were private, that it didn't violate the Constitution, but the idea that the state courts would enforce or enforce that idea, or enforce restrictive covenants, was unconstitutional in itself. So when that got overruled, then the Federal Housing Administration started to defend itself, and it would kind of undermine that decision, saying that it wouldn't change any of its policies, although it would have to. And then they started to say things like having an African American in your area or near your area would devalue your house. So yeah, always having African Americans a negative connotation, trying to kind of create this agenda against them, which not only is it just at that time a prejudice, you also have, it's just being reinforced by the government itself. So
yeah, and when I was presenting this project at a conference, I had a person who also taught AP US government and politics, and she said, what unit does this fit under? And I said, well, it certainly fits under the civil rights unit. I think students are relatively well acquainted with the kind of segregation, Jim Crow laws, Martin Luther King's activism. They're well acquainted with that, but they're not well acquainted with this level of a civil rights issue. And I do think teachers have to go to where there's least understanding and try and inject a little light into that. But then also we have an entire unit on the bureaucracy, and I think many Americans are unaware of the power of bureaucratic rule makers. They look at policymakers that are elected, and they'll say, okay, this is what this law says and that law says. But there's so many blanks that need to be sort of fleshed out by bureaucrats. And often within that, which is highly technical, very much hidden from the public, within those rules is where a lot of systemic inequality lives. But it is so far below the radar that people don't know. So that's one of the other things that I think is great about Rothstein's book, is that he says, look, when we're looking at government action, it isn't just presidential speeches. Sometimes it's somebody who works at the FHA, and they come up with a 600-page policy manual, and living within these pages are the sorts of things that are segregating communities. But that's a tall order for American citizens to really understand, because it's so technical that you'd say, look, well, it's beyond their ability to access it, beyond their ability to understand it, and then they think the real thrust of laws are from the people who give speeches about them, not somebody who works in an office. But that's, in The Color of Law, they really show that those people are the people that are often really directing this whole system.
Yeah, and then the FHA is the federal one, and there was always also state and local housing authorities as well, who would do some very similar things. And I know it was the FHA that had its commissioner was who was it? I think it was the president. Was it the FHA? I think it was the FHA, or
I'm not entirely sure, because there's so much in the book.
But the whole point is that you have people in this really high states of power, and these are the ones who are also kind of enforcing that idea as well. So it just goes to show.
And it's the lower you go in the power structure, the more removed they are from the public. I mean,
Yeah.
ironically, they're more likely to work on the ground level, but people just don't understand the power of bureaucrats as much. I mean, I'm a bureaucrat myself. I'm an unelected person that implements policies. Um, you interact with police officers and teachers, and most people wouldn't interact with somebody who makes the actual policy manual for an IRS document. But that has a big impact on how your taxes are collected and what kind of penalties you might face, and because it really fleshes it out. It's a lot to expect from people to follow that.
Yeah. Speaking about the IRS, I've read that uh, they would like give a tax exempt status to communities that were residentially segregated, or more like organizations like churches and like hospitals, which I thought was also very interesting. So it's just like every form of government, just really
Oh, yeah,
enforcing this
sure.
idea.
Yeah, no, and it's still, it kind of continues. I mean, it's a little off topics. We won't, go down this hole too much, but the reality is that there's like lots of tax exempt groups that are influencing politics, and they are run kind of like a business, but they're not paying taxes like a business. And you would, that is a conversation that people could have about if governments are going to bestow tax exempt status, then they're allowed to create conditions to qualify for tax exempt status. And then, is that good policy making to have certain expectations for fairness, and if you're going to achieve this tax exempt status? Some people think that that would have a chilling effect on these groups if the government puts too many restrictions on it, but tax exempt status is not open to everyone. So when the government grants it, they could have said, you do not qualify for tax exempt status if you're violating American citizens' 14th Amendment right to equal protection. They could have done that, but sometimes there's a problem with how we teach history too. It's hard for people to wrap their head around the power of inaction, because we have this kind of like bias towards things happen, effects are from definite causes, and not necessarily from just lack of action. But there were opportunities to undo some of this. And one of the things I like about how Rothstein writes, he very quickly, at the beginning of the book, he says, if I think something is clearly unconstitutional, I'm just going to call it unconstitutional. And he says, I understand that sometimes I'm using this phrase, and a legal scholar would say, well, that hasn't been determined to be unconstitutional, but he's the author, and he says, I understand what it means to be treated equally under the law. And if the Supreme Court didn't do it, he basically says these are unconstitutional policies, these are unconstitutional, almost like unconstitutional decisions, that's a bit of a oxymoron. Like, anything the Supreme Court decides is technically constitutional. But he rejects that. He calls it out, which I think makes the book pretty readable, as long as you understand where he's coming from.
Yeah, no, I get. Yeah, no, I actually remember reading that like exact phrase. I think I mentioned something like along the lines of that in my essay, like mentioning that I like, by me saying unconstitutional, I'm adopting Rothstein's point of view, in the sense that although legally it hasn't been determined to be unconstitutional, it still goes against the Constitution. So yeah, what I also think is like, which is like kind of crazy, is the amount of violence that African Americans would face if they had the opportunity to move on a block where it was like predominantly white people. I think one of the chapters goes over is a whole chapter on violence uh, on African Americans who like moved in white neighborhoods. So I think I wrote I wrote I wrote some notes on one of the stories because I think the best way to address like issues like these, because you have my audience, I want to be like the entirety of like American citizens, qualified American citizens who can vote, or not even that, the because I also want to like people to be educated on it, but I also want people to take action in terms of like voting for policymakers who support ideas that would help remedy the situation. I think the best way to get to people is through like stories, because you can always provide like a bunch of statistics and data, but at the end of the day, what moves people is like emotion. So, this is from 1952, and this would happen in Richmond, California. Wilbur Gary, he was in search of housing, but the area in which he wanted to buy a house had a restrictive covenant. But because of the Shelley versus Kramer ruling, he got legal backing by the NAACP, and they weren't able to like go to court and enforce the restrictive covenant. And people would even like in the neighborhood would like offer to buy the house at like a marked up price. That's how desperate they were for him not to live there. But eventually he lived there. He rejected all those offers. But shortly after he moved in, a mob of about 300 whites gathered outside their house, shouting epithets and hurling bricks. One that even like some that like breaking windows. That's just like that in itself is illegal. Just like destroying someone's property. So, but surprisingly, no one was arrested. So I think that shows you also the role that law enforcement played in that they weren't really able to get proper protection. Initially, the NAACP had to provide protection to the family, and then eventually they were able to get some protection by local police, but even then, it wouldn't be enough. So
Yeah,
yeah,
sorry, go ahead.
yeah, no, and that's just like one story of like many that's happened. So it's not like this was one odd case. This happened in many places.
Yeah, that's one of the things I think Rothstein puts that as one of his later chapters too, because you can see that there are broadly unfair policies. There are tiny hidden policies that are prejudiced, that are just evil and clever. But at the end of the day, that was a card that racist people could play, that even if their loopholes and their legal obstacles were undone, they could still resort to violence, or at least the threat of violence. Mm-hmm. And that's a powerful thing, especially when you're talking about generally the people who buy homes they come in families. Yes. And families often come with children who are vulnerable. So that is a powerful deterrent. And what makes it especially awful is that it also reinforces the idea that people of color just didn't have access to the rule of law. And for the United States, we talk about lots of elements of the American system and things that work, but the thing that's kind of underplayed is the value of the rule of law, that you're supposed to have access to courts and you're supposed to have predictable experiences. And when governments exist initially to try and give people an opportunity to be secure in their property and their physical well-being. You know, that instead of you having to use violence to defend yourself from violence, you're supposed to have access to the government that you pay for so that they can protect your property and your life. And this is like the essence, this is like John Locke stuff, like life, liberty, and property. And this man that you described in that anecdote, I mean, he's paying for police service, and he's through his taxes, and they're not protecting him from an angry mob that's there to destroy his property. It's so it's terrible for him. It creates like almost like a shadow government that will use violence to enforce its rules, and it undermines the feeling that African Americans could be represented by the government that they help pay for. So it's just awful in the moment, but then awful on a lot of other different levels, for sure.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so just to recap everything we spoke about so far, it's, I think not only was it mainly government who enforcing policies that would promote residential segregation. You had private agreements as well, which government would also promote as well, under the notion that they were private. But then you'd have Supreme Court rulings that would undo these. But then there's always this this theme of finding another way in order to get what they wanted, which was, you know, making sure that white housing was separated from black housing. And yeah, and I think violence definitely was like the last resort, and it's crazy to think that the local police didn't even stop it, or stop it from happening, and no arrests were made in this specific case, at least. And so there's always a way for people to get what they wanted, or the white families in those neighborhoods to get what they wanted. And yeah, I think an issue this big is like very hard to like address or give like a concrete solution to. But it definitely is important to, I'd say, like all people who live in the United States, because whether it happens to you directly or indirectly, in the sense that you have friends or family who experience this, I think it's important to understand like the effects that it's had, like lasting over many years. It's not necessarily the people's fault in the neighborhood I live in, which is like much less in terms of income. It's not their fault that they're poor. I wouldn't say that. I'd say that it's more this idea that that they weren't given the proper opportunities, or generations before them weren't given the proper opportunities. They lived in a state of inferiority, or that's how they believed. And you know, that also builds up frustration, and that builds up hatred. And I think that has to do with like kind of like also like crime in areas like that as well. And it's kind of sad to see like a recurring theme of like kids I grew up in my neighborhood. You know, I'd see them, I'd see some like, you know, go to jail, or they do other things like gang activity, and it's like a common thing, like their brothers would do that, or their fathers would go to jail, and it's not their fault that they're doing that, really, because they don't have the proper guidance, and it's also been an effect of how detrimented these communities have been. And being like a firsthand witness to that is like very upsetting to see. Um, while I see, I see this going on like right in front of me, half a mile away, I see people thriving, and I start to think, that's, it's kind of unfair to the people that live around me for them to be in that situation because, uh, unfortunately, it's just like it's kind of like all they know, and it's sad to see.
Yeah, it's and one of the things that makes us, because based on our conversation, it's kind of like recapping, we know that there are political effects, we know there are economic effects, we know there are social effects, psychological effects. And I believe it's in the next session of the Supreme Court, the constitutionality of affirmative action programs are going to be decided again. It's been decided in the 1970s and then the 1990s, but this debate will come up again. It'll be in the hands of the Supreme Court, and probably one of the things they're going to have to consider is what is the value of affirmative action programs. And you can't really consider that unless you ask yourself, what is the modern relevance of the inequalities that put the affirmative action programs into effect? And if people believe that those inequalities have been solved, then you're more likely to assume that you don't need these programs anymore. And this is, I hope that any one of those members of the Supreme Court that are going to decide on affirmative action, I think they should have a book club and read Color of Law.
Yeah.
We'll see.
Yeah. I also think like a big issue with the whole belief that de facto segregation was like the main source of segregated communities among the U.S. It kind of like starts to blame African Americans for their own, like, let's say, communities who are like less or more poor, more impoverished. People start to think that the government is like handing out gifts to them, which I don't believe they're handing out gifts. I think although some people like might exploit some parts of it, it's also just, even those programs aren't enough to like kind of remedy what has happened to them, because it's like a huge persisting issue that you can't really fix with just, like I said, welfare program.
Yeah,
it's an issue that can only be solved if it can be solved throughout like a large period of time.
Yeah, for sure. So the end of the book, he gives a series of possible solutions, and with the project, I made sure that I asked my students to evaluate that, not simply because I have a lot of trust in my students' ability and to use their critical thinking skills. I don't say like, hey, Rothstein has it figured out, and then we should do what Rothstein says. So I sort of invite the students to evaluate his ideas. And the one that always stuck out to me was, he said, maybe African Americans should be sold homes that are at a price that was proportional to the price that would have been available to them if they didn't have restricted covenants in places like Levittown. And he said, like, typically a $400,000 house, then he said African American buyers should have access to it for $160,000. He said that's like the modern day equivalent of your $8,000 home that you could have bought, if you were just finished serving the country in World War II and part of the new boom. And I asked students, is that realistic? Generally, if I did a head count and I'm reading their reflections, most say it is not realistic. And then there is a conversation about, if that's not realistic, are there other ways to sort of transfer some of the benefits that were lost? Because there was a denial of benefits. Mm-hmm. So what can you do to recap it? And that's an ongoing conversation. My personal teaching philosophy is to not spend a lot of time. I just like to sort of facilitate conversation and see kind of where it goes from there. But it's interesting. I by the end of the year, I mean, 3/4 of the way through the year when we're doing this project, I have seen some of my students' political leanings, and I feel like when I was presenting this project at a conference, I contacted some of my more politically conservative students, ones that you graduated with, and I wanted to know how they felt about the project. And when I asked them, did you feel like, was it fair? Or was it, I was very happy to say, they didn't even really understand what I was talking about. They said, I don't understand, why would why would this project bother me? The subject, what they learned, bothered them because it's disturbing.
Yeah.
But the fact that they were exposed to it, they said, like, I think sometimes people don't give high school students, especially older high school students, enough credit to tackle complex and difficult issues like this. So far, I should have my fingers crossed sign here. So far, I've gotten really good feedback from students from all kinds of political leanings, because it's just clearly something that was wrong.
Yeah, no,
and it matters.
Yeah, that is reassuring to hear.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's I think it's overall just like bizarre. But I get it, like, you have a policy, like, if you like, it's pretty unrealistic and I wouldn't say unrealistic, it would be hard to get something like that passed, because I remember reading, like, what Rothstein said about selling homes of what they would have been for, like, their grandparents, which, I thought, I was like, yeah, that sounds like a reasonable idea for what they went through, and that would be a pretty good way to kind of remedy that. But then you have to consider who would be up for that. Who, like, you have, like, the local taxpayers, like, they probably wouldn't like that. So then it all really just depends on, like, kind of like what side you lean on, and or if you just don't know about it and you think that they're giving gifts away or something like that. So yeah,
I think students at Lehigh, if you're interested in this and you want awareness to be improved on the issue, Lehigh, I'm sure, is a well-resourced university. They should try and get Richard Rothstein to do a speaking engagement.
yeah,
and
that would be.
I mean, I have to say, he was very generous to speak to my students, via Zoom, for free. I put out the word. I told him we did this project, and then I asked if he could speak during February, and he said, no, I unfortunately, I'm booked completely because it's an important issue for African Americans and Black History Month. It was just crowded his schedule too much, and I said, well, how about any single day in March? And he said, okay, yeah, and he gave us a 40-minute block of his time. He's a very important person, and I imagine Lehigh would probably have to pay him to come to speak, but I think that's a great use of those funds. And I would urge anyone at Lehigh, if they came to hear Richard Rothstein speak, to take the same approach we took in my class, which is you are not required to agree with his solutions, but if you read his book or if you hear him speak, his book is extremely high level of scholarship. What he is sharing happens. And I think anyone who would read the book or hear him speak would agree that it happened. They'd agree that it's relevant. And then the extent to which you agree with his solutions is that's why we have universities, to have free thinking people that can come up with a variety of answers. And but yeah, no, that'd be a nice little sort of side project. There's probably some sort of student governance group that makes recommendations on who should come to the school, and I think that would be worth kind of lobbying them and saying, let's see if we can get Rothstein.
Yeah, I'll see what I can do about that. I have to find out which group here would be able to do that. But yeah, I know some clubs have a lot of funding. So
Yes.
I also think like a question with also like Rothstein addresses in his book is we weren't born in that time period, or our parents, like let's say you're kind of like an immigrant, our parents weren't even there during segregation. Why should we be forced to like remedy it or like sacrifice in order to help remedy it, right? And the way he quotes, I think it was the president of the NAACP, saying that you weren't there in 1776, yet you enjoy hot dogs on July 4th, right? So like what I got from that is that, being a citizen, it not only entails like the privileges that we didn't earn.
Hold on a sec, Jahid.
Oh. Yeah, no. So, it not only entails the privileges that we didn't earn, because we have people who have fought through many wars for freedom, and we're here enjoying our freedom. But I haven't personally fought in any wars, or anything like that. So, but I'm still here, enjoying that privilege of freedom. And so because of that, we should also be willing to correct things that maybe we didn't commit, or like something that past governments have done. So now our government, many years into the future, has the responsibility to fix. So yeah, I mean that's also a recurring theme. You have you have government always, fixing itself by the people.
Yeah, and I mean, some people might see this as kind of a moral imperative to address these, but even if you didn't, you would think that there should be support for a system that's sustainable.
Yeah.
And really lives up to the aspirations that were set at the outset. Generally we believe that in America there is at least a agreement that there should be equality of opportunity. We get into different debates and different viewpoints about whether or not we should be supportive of equality of outcome, but certainly equality of opportunity. And all of these things make a mockery of that. So even if you didn't see it in moral terms, if you just said, we need to make sure that our system is sustainable and lives up to the best of its aspirations, then something needs to be done to address this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, no, Rothstein also, I think in the preface, says that it's kind of like a moral obligation, or we can't really call ourselves, what was the word he used, like constitutional democracy, if we can't uh, undo our wrongs, which I think was a very powerful wording. But yeah, I mean, as as far as fixes go, it is hard to find one proper fix, and there are many proposed like ideas. But what is something that has been working, which also in the book has been like inclusionary zoning, and specifically I'm talking about an area in Maryland, Montgomery County. So 12 to 15% of the units in affluent communities are set aside for moderate income families, and a third of those units are set aside for rental to the lowest income families. And the effect of that is that those African American families who are able to live in those communities now, because those units of housing were set aside for them, their children, although even if they're low income, they've been performing at higher standards than like the national average, which I think that's a very big success, because one of like the most detrimental effects of residential segregation is the effects on income and the schooling, the quality of schooling that they get. So to see that this like inclusionary zoning is working in this one county is great to see, that you have a higher level of education for even low income African Americans.
Yeah, and one thing, my larger studies about political science, one thing we know is that it is extremely hard to get people to change their views. But when it works, it is very often just through human interaction and relationships. And that can come when people are in proximity to one another. I mean, if you just do not know anyone from these groups, then you're going to substitute maybe your personal experience for, in some cases, people substitute it for prejudice, the stereotypes. Yeah. And if you were to pursue something like that, like inclusionary zoning, just when you hold a backyard party and you have different faces at that party and you get in conversations and you build relationships with people, that begins to weaken the power of stereotypes. And people literally have experience with people. So it has like a social and psychological effect of that kind of policy, but a positive one, which is refreshing.
Yeah, and then the idea of like integrating these communities for like in schools, it creates like a greater diversity. So instead of having the school just be predominantly white, you're having it mixed with all sorts of racial groups, which I think is good as someone like as a child in school to be exposed to, because it teaches you like because you get to experience who these people are just by talking to them. It changes your whole point of view on the world, on how you see these people, because otherwise, if that wasn't the case, and you weren't really exposed to these types of people, the only thing you could get from them is kind of like stereotypes. So yeah, I think that's important. The diversity that you get from like integrating communities.
For sure.
So yeah, I'd say overall that's all I wanted to speak about, and it's a great conversation, and it was great having you here. So I want to take this time to thank you for taking time out of your day out of your morning to speak with me about it and helping me with this project. I really appreciate it.
I loved it because it feels like a little ripple effect from something that happened in my class. So that's what I'm looking for. And so I believe I'm going to have your brother Kayam next year. Is that your brother?
He's
Or
going
is that
into
a concept?
11th grade. 11th grade.
I might
He's
have
my
him because
brother, yeah. So
I teach AP research. So I suspect I'll have him then and the next year. But I'm still looking forward to
yeah.
your family is going to have the record in my teaching career, most siblings that I have taught within one family. So, and
Yeah.
everyone's been great. So I really appreciate this. This has been a great experience for me too, and I'm really glad that you're integrating it into this course that you're taking. And like I said, if anyone wants any information about that project, I'd be more than happy to see it because to share it, I should say, because it's just traveling further on the social network, which I
Yeah.
think is great.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much, Mr. Budgets. I really appreciate it.
All right, no problem.
All right.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.